And then here we get on to the next, so these guys are all kind of related, right? They're kind of contemporaries with each other. So the first case in 1948 was this guy named Harry Benjamin was very interested in the idea of changing genders through what we now call affirmative care, or basically sex hormone replacement therapy. And so Alfred Kinsey knew about Harry Benjamin's interest in this. And then he had a first case in 1948. He kept working on how he was going to do these transitions medically. And then Christine Jorgensen was really famous. You guys know Christine Jorgensen, probably if you study history, probably the most famous transsexual. That's the old term that they used to, it's considered offensive by some today, but that's the old term for it, was transsexual. And so it was a male that really wanted to be female, went over to Europe, got surgery, came back, looked very feminine, definitely looked like a female, and was captivating the press. It was all over the news. And then the transsexual phenomenon, he wrote that. It was called Pioneering. It was the first work advocating for what we now call affirmative care, or sex hormone treatments, and also surgeries. Actually, back in the day, they didn't. They originally just did it more with surgeries, and now we're getting into puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. That kind of came later. And then Harry Benjamin, International Gender Dysphoria Association. So people were very interested in his work, and he gave them permission to use his name as part of the original Gender Dysphoria Association in 1979. And they released what's called a Standards of Care, which is their recommended medical treatments for folks that are transgender, that want to transition into a different sex. One thing I should point about this is from the beginning, the standards of care actually never, and still today, do not meet the medical standards required for a standards of care. When you talk about a standards of care document, it has to be highly researched, and there's criteria for it. So even today, the WPATH, so now they're called WPATH, has issued a standards of care, edition 8, right? So we're up to edition 8, and it still doesn't meet the criteria for standards of care because the research just isn't there. It's not like you would get, like if you were doing a standards of care for diabetes, much more detailed, right? Other conditions are much more detailed research things. So the new, and I will mention this, is kind of an important point, the new standards of care, I actually think since edition 5 of the standards of care, it's gone downhill. So 5 was probably the most scientific it's been, and then because it required like living 2 years in your gender identity and 2 referrals from a psychologist, which then got reduced to, in the next edition, like one year and 1 psychologist, and then in the 7th edition, it was, well, there's no requirement we recommend psychologists, but we don't require it. Basically, in the 8th edition, if you declare you're transgender, you're good to go. You don't need a psychological assessment, live in the gender, or anything. You can just go to Planned Parenthood or another place and get the hormones and the surgeries. They still recommend that you consider it, but it's not required. They become much looser. They also eliminated any age limits. So in the 7th edition, they actually had age limits, like, oh, you shouldn't get a mastectomy before this age. So they eliminated all those for the surgeries. All the minimum ages are gone, except for phalloplasty, which is the artificial construction of a penis. So that's the only one, and that's 18. So I think the series have gone downhill. You can actually go on the internet and read them for yourself. They're very long, and see if you agree. The other weird thing that happened in the 8th edition is they removed the ethics section. So you have a standards of care for medicine that eliminated its chapter on ethics. That does not make sense, right? And they added a whole chapter on a eunuch identity. So the eunuch identity is the idea that an otherwise healthy male may feel his true identity, doesn't really identify as transgender, but feel his true identity is to be neutered. And there is a guide now for doing that. So they're basically saying this is an acceptable idea that you might want to become a eunuch. You might intentionally want to have that done to you.
So you're saying that they made all these changes?
They made the changes since the 5th edition, yeah.
And who are they?
WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health.
Okay.
Started originally by this guy,
Sure.
Terry Benjamin.
What's their process?
So
Like, do they have peer review? How do they choose who makes these decisions?
yeah, so they do cite research, but it's interesting. So in looking at the research, they actually say there isn't enough research to conduct a systematic review, but here are our recommendations. So that's contradictory, right? You can't, like, normally, if you don't have enough research to conduct a systematic review, you don't have enough research to make recommendations. But that's actually, in some sections, they basically admit that.
So in the United States,
Yes.
who uses this source
Yes.
as their definitive statement on moving forward with?
Most people. So this is a great question. So the question was, just repeated, who uses this as a standard? So obviously people in a gender care clinic and gender specialists would do this, but also the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics all reference this.
So they all validate this work?
Well, they don't validate, they reference it, is
Well,
what I would say.
do they use it for their own standard setting?
Yeah, they
do.
basically make reference to it in their recommendations. So for instance, the Endocrine Society will reference this, right, in some of the same studies that they do. But yeah.
Is that how they validate their recommendations, though? Do they
Yes,
use-
I think they're relying on
So the
this as like,
American
we
Medical-
trust WPATH is basically
Yeah.
why.
So all those associations?
Yes.
Trust WPATH?
They trust WPATH.
Interesting.
Yes, so when people say, this is validated by, 100 medical associations, okay, but they're all relying on this discredited source.
Or
It is-
all of those sources have vetted and trust that source. One or the other, right?
Well, you can argue either way.
Either
yeah,
they're
yeah.
all fooled,
Yeah,
or they're all packed with experts who are validating this.
right.
One or the other,
Right,
right?
and I would argue it's the other, it's that
Oh,
it's not, right?
Right.
Because if you actually read the recommendations of the Endocrine Society, so they say in their recommendations, right, that the evidence that we have is low quality or very low quality. Oh, and by the way, we recommend that you do this affirmative care thing.
Mm.
So they're admitting that it's not good evidence, and they're making the recommendation anyway. So even by their own, writing, so the Endocrine Society has a standard, it's called GRADE, and I forget what it stands for. It's basically a way to evaluate, systematic reviews, and they admit, like, we don't have a lot of good evidence. And there's a whole story there, like when they first rolled out this new standard. So normally, just to talk a little bit about the Endocrine Society, normally when they go and they roll out a standard like this, like for instance, adrenal tumors, endocrinologists will operate on adrenal tumors. So you'll go to the Endocrine Society conference, and they'll have these experts that will talk for hours and debating the evidence, pro and con, and talking about, like, what should we do? What should our recommendation be for operating on these tumors, right? And it's like this brilliant time. The doctors that go there say, oh, this is just brilliant. These are like some of the best people in the world, and they're debating, and then they come to figure out, like, what their standards are going to be, right? So when they announce, the Endocrine Society announced, oh, we have a new standard for transgender care, and it's affirm the child and agree with what they want. And if you question this, you are transphobic. That was actually what happened in the conference, according to a man named William Malone. I can point you to his podcast he was on where he talks about this experience. And he's a Stanford-educated doctor, and he said, wait a second. Everything else we recommend requires strong evidence, and we have this huge debate, we have this conference, and before we put this together, we make sure we're right. But anybody that questioned that conference was told, you're transphobic. WPATH has conferences too. So there's a researcher named Dr. Lisa Littman who has figured out that there's a very good probability, many scientists believe it's true, that this rapid increase in folks having a gender identity other than their biological sex is socially mediated through social media, right? So she's done a lot of research on this, multiple studies. She went to present to WPATH and basically said it was like a cheerleading session for affirmative care, and you could literally be shouted down if you did not agree with affirmative care. So the other thing you have to remember, not just about WPATH, but medical associations in general, is they are actually not scientific bodies. People don't realize that. What do you mean, American Medical Association? They're actually an advocacy group. That's actually what their file is, right? So they're trying to release scientific recommendations, but you have to understand when doctors are trained, what are they trained to do? They're trained to trust the recommendations of their medical association. So if you're an endocrinologist, you don't have time to read the underlying research. You just go with whatever the recommendations are. If you're a psychologist, you may not even deal with these types of patients. You're just going to trust what the American Psychological Association tells you. So science is built on a chain of trust. And what we're saying is the trust is broken at the lowest level of the actual fundamental evidence that WPATH and other organizations rely on.
So
and Europe now agrees with this, by the way. They've done systematic reviews, and they actually agree with that position.
So the Endocrine Society?
Endocrine Society is one. There's the American Medical Association. There's the American Academy of Pediatrics. There's lots of organizations that have signed on to this. But if you actually look at, like,
the evidence that they looked at. For instance, what was the one tribute that you testified about? The American Association of Pediatricians, right? With their recommendations were actually written by a doctor in training.
Yes.
The doctor was being trained by, and I don't remember her name, but she was the blue-haired lady in the What is a Woman video that Matt Walsh put together. Who's an advocate, right? They're advocates for this type of care.
Well, sure,
And-
people advocate.
and that's
That
fine,
doesn't mean
yeah.
that they're not
Yeah.
really.
I'm not discrediting
trained.
it, yeah, but I'm just saying, so, and basically what happened in that situation, I talked to one of the doctors that actually is a member of that association, and she said, well, basically the older doctors there didn't understand where this came from, and basically the other doctors ultimately said, well, they wanted to be, quote, on the right side of history, and they thought this was being seen more as a civil rights agenda rather than a medical evidence issue. And so basically it became like a political decision, and apparently nobody fact-checked the writing, because many of the statements that are in there are simply, like, they'll cite a study, but the study says the opposite of what they claimed it did. So there's a Cantor critique, C-A-N-T-O-R, if you want to find it, who actually goes through these recommendations and said, well, they said the study said this, but it actually says the opposite. Here's another one, right? So I'm just saying, bottom line, without belaboring this, I don't want to get too caught up here, is the evidence just isn't there. And a lot of European countries, like the UK, Finland, Sweden, they all have done systematic reviews, found evidence to be lacking, and they're backing away from affirmative care. So this was not meant to be affirmative